You tell yourself you're not meant for greatness because of where you came from, your background, or your current circumstances. Every day you watch others achieve what you dream about, while that voice in your head whispers that success belongs to other people, the lucky ones, the connected ones, the ones who started with advantages you'll never have. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, and I rose from a minor Corsican family to crown myself Emperor of France, conquering most of Europe in the process. What I discovered about destroying limiting beliefs will transform how you see yourself, and what you believe is possible for your life. The same principles that took me from artillery officer to emperor can take you from wherever you are to wherever you dare to dream, because the battlefield of the mind is where all victories begin. Like this video, subscribe for more imperial wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. Want to know which corner of the world is ready to crown itself with possibility? Let me take you back to where it all began, not in the palaces of Versailles or the grand estates of French nobility, but in the rugged hills of Corsica, where I first learned that the world would try to tell me who I was before I had the chance to decide for myself. I was 9 years old when I left my island home for the French mainland, speaking broken French with a thick Corsican accent that marked me immediately as an outsider. My father had secured me a place at the military school in Brienne, and I remember thinking this was my great opportunity. How naive I was to believe that merit alone would open doors. The moment I stepped into that school, I felt the weight of their stares. To my French classmates, I wasn't Napoleon Bonaparte, was the Corsican, spoken with the same tone they might use for the peasant or the barbarian. They mocked my accent, they laughed at my clothes, and they made it clear that I would never be one of them. Most children would have tried to fit in, to soften their accent, to abandon their heritage. But something in me rebelled against this expectation. Why should I be ashamed of who I was? Why should I pretend to be less Corsican to be more acceptable? In that moment of rejection, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I would not diminish myself to make others comfortable. I spent my first months at Brienne in relative isolation, but I didn't waste that solitude. While my classmates played their games and gossiped about court politics, I buried myself in books. I read about Alexander the Great, about Caesar, about the military campaigns that had shaped history. I studied mathematics, strategy, and philosophy. They thought they were punishing me with exclusion, but they were actually giving me the greatest gift, time to build myself into something they couldn't ignore. The more they tried to make me feel small, the larger my ambitions grew. They whispered that Corsicans were simple mountain folk, good for nothing but shepherding and simple trades. I decided I would become a general. They suggested that my family's modest means would keep me forever in their shadow. I began planning my rise to power. You see, that's when I discovered my first great truth about limiting beliefs. They're not actually about your capabilities, they're about other people's need to keep you in a place where they feel comfortable. My classmates didn't reject me because I lacked talent. They rejected me because my hunger and determination made them uncomfortable with their own complacency. I learned to transform every slight into fuel. When they called me Le Petit Caporal because of my height, I embraced it and made it a symbol of someone who leads from the front lines. When they mocked my accent, I spoke with even greater conviction until my words carried such force that no one dared interrupt. When they excluded me from their social circles, I built my own network of allies based on merit rather than birthright. By the time I graduated from Brienne, I had developed what I now call the Corsican principle. Your origins don't determine your destination, your response to limitation does. The very things the world tells you disqualify you from greatness are often the exact qualities that will fuel your rise, if you have the courage to embrace them rather than apologize for them. I carried my father's sword not as a reminder of noble heritage, but as a symbol that nobility isn't inherited, it's earned through courage, action, and the refusal to accept other people's definitions of your potential. That sword would eventually help me carve out an empire. But its first victory was teaching a 9-year-old boy that no one else gets to decide what you're capable of becoming. My instructors at the military academy wrote in their reports that I was reserved and studious, as if these were weaknesses rather than the weapons I was forging in the fires of their indifference. They saw a quiet student who kept to himself. They had no idea they were observing a future emperor planning his revolution. The École Militaire in Paris was supposed to be the pinnacle of military education, the place where France's future officers were molded from the sons of nobility. When I arrived there from Brienne, I carried with me not just my few possessions, but the accumulated weight of years of being told I didn't belong in their world. The rejection was subtle but constant. While my classmates discussed their family, estates, and court connections, I listened and learned about the networks of power that seemed forever closed to someone like me. They spoke of military commissions guaranteed by family influence, of positions waiting for them upon graduation, of futures mapped out by generations of privilege. I could have allowed this to discourage me. I could have accepted the limiting belief that success in the military anywhere acquired connections I would never have. Instead, I made a different choice. If they had connections, I would have competence. If they had influence, I would have excellence. If they had guarantees, I would have an unstoppable work ethic. Every evening while they attended social gatherings and built their networks of privilege, I was in the library studying the campaigns of history's greatest military minds. I dissected every battle, analyzed every strategy, memorized every tactical innovation. They were learning to be officers. I was learning to be a commander. The academy's instructors couldn't quite figure me out. My academic performance was exceptional, but I showed little interest in the social hierarchies that consumed my classmates. I spoke only when I had something meaningful to contribute, which they interpreted as antisocial behavior rather than strategic thinking. One particular incident crystallized my understanding of how limiting beliefs operate in institutions designed to perpetuate existing power structures. During a military exercise, I proposed a tactical solution that contradicted the established doctrine taught by our instructors. My approach would have been more effective, but it challenged the wisdom of men who had never seen real combat. The instructor dismissed my suggestion without consideration, reminding me that I was there to learn established methods, not to innovate. In that moment, I realized that institutions often prefer conformity to competence, tradition to effectiveness. They weren't rejecting my idea because it was wrong. They were rejecting it because it came from someone they had already decided wasn't authorized to challenge their thinking. This taught me a profound lesson about the nature of limiting beliefs. In hierarchical systems, the most dangerous limitations aren't the ones others place on you, they're the ones you place on yourself. By accepting their authority to define your capabilities, I decided that day that I would never again allow someone else's comfort with the status quo to limit my pursuit of excellence. When I graduated from the academy, my final report described me as having much ambition, but lacking the social graces necessary for advancement in the officer corps. They meant it as a warning, but I received it as a prophecy. They had identified exactly what would take me further than any of them would ever go. Unbounded ambition, untempered by their comfortable acceptance of mediocrity. I left that academy with something more valuable than a commission. I left with the absolute certainty that excellence is the ultimate revenge against a system designed to keep you in your place. While they had spent their time learning to fit in, I had spent mine learning to stand out. While they had developed social skills for advancement within existing structures, I had developed the intellectual firepower to create new ones. The limiting belief that outsiders can't succeed died for me in those halls of privilege. I realized that being an outsider wasn't my weakness, it was my advantage. I wasn't constrained by their rules, their expectations, or their definitions of what was possible. I was free to innovate, to experiment, to think beyond the boundaries they had accepted as permanent. Years later, when the first commanded armies and conquered nations, I would remember those nights in the library when I chose education over social acceptance. Every victory traced back to that decision to use rejection as fuel rather than allowing it to become limitation. Asterisk, asterisk, fresh from the academy, I entered the French artillery as a second lieutenant, carrying the weight of expectations not from those who believed in me, but from those who were certain I would fail. The artillery was considered a technical branch, suitable for those who understood mathematics, but lacked the aristocratic bearing for cavalry or the social connections for staff positions. They assigned me to the artillery because they thought it would contain me. What they didn't understand was that they had just given me the perfect laboratory to prove that results matter more than pedigree, that innovation trumps tradition, and that concentrated force applied at the right point can break through any resistance. My fellow officers approached their duties with the casual confidence of men who knew their advancement was assured by birth rather than performance. They had never questioned whether their methods were the best possible. They had simply inherited them along with their commissions. But I approached every aspect of artillery science as if my life depended on perfecting it, because in many ways it did. While they saw cannons as tools to be operated according to established procedures, I saw them as instruments of concentrated possibility. I studied ballistics with the intensity of a man possessed, calculated trajectories with mathematical precision they found unnecessary, and developed innovations in positioning and timing that they dismissed as overly complicated. The moment that changed everything came during the siege of Toulon. The city had been taken by Royalist forces and British allies, and the Republic's army had been failing for months to recapture it. The conventional approach, direct assault on the strongest fortifications, had resulted in nothing but casualties and frustration. When I surveyed the situation, I saw what the others had missed. They were focused on attacking where the enemy expected attack. I identified a position that would allow us to place artillery fire directly on the harbour, making it impossible for British ships to supply the garrison. Cut off the supply, and the strongest fortress becomes untenable. My commanding officers initially resisted the plan. It deviated from orthodox siege warfare. It required moving heavy guns to positions others deemed impossible, and it came from a young lieutenant they barely knew. But desperation had made them more open to unconventional thinking, and they allowed me to attempt what textbook warfare had failed to accomplish. The success was complete and decisive. By placing artillery where no one thought artillery could be effective, we forced the evacuation of Toulon within days. The British fleet withdrew, the Royalist garrison surrendered, and the Republic had its victory. More importantly for me, I had proven that superior thinking could overcome superior resources. That victory earned me promotion to colonel at the age of 24. But more significantly, it shattered the limiting belief that rank determines capability. My innovative approach had succeeded where experienced generals had failed. Not because I was inherently superior, but because I refused to accept that established methods were the only possible methods. I learnt that most people limit themselves with imaginary boundaries. They assume that because something has always been done a certain way, it must be the best way. They mistake familiarity for optimality, tradition for truth. But every seemingly impossible position becomes possible when you change your angle of approach. The cannon that broke the siege of Toulon became my symbol for concentrated force, applied with precision. In artillery, you learned that a small projectile, properly aimed and timed, can demolish structures that seem impregnable. The same principle applies to destroying limiting beliefs. Concentrated effort, applied at exactly the right point, can shatter barriers that appeared absolute. From that moment forward, I began to see obstacles differently. Where others saw insurmountable problems, I saw targeting opportunities. Where others accepted limitations as facts, I saw them as challenges, waiting for the right combination of force and precision. Every barrier became a puzzle to solve, rather than a reason to surrender. The artillery taught me that power without precision is waste. But precision without power is pointless. You need both the force to break through resistance and the intelligence to know exactly where to apply that force. This became my approach to every limiting belief I would encounter. Identified the exact point where concentrated effort could shatter the entire structure of limitation. My fellow officers began to understand that something had shifted in their ranks. The quiet lieutenant who had seemed destined for obscurity had demonstrated capabilities that demanded recognition. But more importantly, I had demonstrated to myself that extraordinary results were possible when you refused to accept ordinary thinking as your ceiling. When the Directory appointed me commander of the Army of Italy at 26, I could feel the skepticism radiating from every veteran officer under my command. Here was their new general, young, short, foreign-born, and carrying a reputation built on one successful siege rather than years of traditional military service. I remember walking into that first meeting with my senior staff, seeing the barely concealed doubt in their eyes. They had fought for years in Italy with limited success, facing Austrian and Piedmontese forces that seemed impossible to defeat with their poorly supplied, demoralized army. Now they were expected to follow someone who looked more like their younger brother than their commanding general. The limiting belief I faced was as old as hierarchy itself. That age equals wisdom, that experience trumps innovation, that youth disqualifies you from leadership, regardless of your capabilities. Every conversation carried the unspoken question, how can someone so young possibly understand what we need to do here? But I had learned something crucial from my artillery days, that concentrated force applied at the right point can overcome any resistance. I decided to apply this principle not just to military strategy, but to the problem of earning the respect and loyalty of men who had every reason to doubt me. My first action was to study every detail of our situation with an intensity that surprised them, while they expected a young general to rely on their experience. I demonstrated that I would master every aspect of our challenges personally. I knew our supply situation better than our quartermaster, our troop dispositions better than our staff officers, and our enemy's capabilities better than our intelligence network. Then came the moment that would define everything, the Battle of Montenot. Instead of following the conventional approach of massing our entire force for a single decisive engagement, I divided our army and struck at the weakest point in the enemy's extended line. While they expected us to attack where they were strongest, we hit them where they were most vulnerable. The victory was swift and complete, but more importantly, it demonstrated to my officers that youth, combined with innovation, could achieve what experience alone had not. When I led the charge across the bridge at Lodi, placing myself in the same danger as the common soldiers, something shifted in how they saw me. They began calling me Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal, not as a mockery of my height, but as recognition that I would fight alongside them rather than merely direct them from safety. In that moment, I learned one of the most powerful principles for destroying limiting beliefs about leadership. You earn authority not by demanding it, but by demonstrating that you're willing to share the same risks you ask others to take. Victory followed victory with a speed that stunned our enemies and energized our army. Millesimo, Dago, Sever, Mondoviec battle proved that rapid movement, concentrated force, and innovative tactics could overcome superior numbers and traditional strategies. But more than military victories, these were victories over the limiting belief that hierarchy must be respected regardless of competence. My soldiers stopped seeing a young general and started seeing someone who could lead them to victories they had thought impossible. My officers stopped questioning my age and started implementing strategies that contradicted everything they had learned about conventional warfare. The Austrian generals stopped underestimating our capabilities and started treating us as a threat, worthy of their full attention. But the greatest transformation was in how I saw myself. Each victory reinforced my growing understanding that most limitations exist only in the minds of those who accept them. The same army that had been demoralized and ineffective under previous leadership became unstoppable when given clear objectives, innovative strategies, and a commander willing to share their dangers. I learned that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to act decisively when others hesitate. It's not about being the oldest or most experienced person in the room. It's about being the one who can see opportunities where others see only obstacles. The Italian campaign taught me that the limiting belief "you're too young to lead" is really just another way of saying you're too innovative to be comfortable. Established leaders often resist new approaches, not because they don't work, but because they challenge the assumptions that have defined their entire careers. When I crossed that bridge at Lodi, under enemy fire, I wasn't just leading an attack, I was destroying the belief that leadership requires permission from those you seek to lead. True authority comes from demonstrating value, not from demanding recognition. When you lead from the front and deliver results that matter, age becomes irrelevant and experience becomes secondary to effectiveness. Asterisk. When I set sail for Egypt in 1798, I carried with me the confidence of a man who had conquered Italy and the ambition to become the new Alexander. What I brought back was something far more valuable: the understanding that apparent failure can be the greatest teacher of all, if you have the wisdom to extract its lessons rather than be destroyed by its disappointments. The Egyptian campaign was supposed to be my masterpiece, bold strike at British interests that would establish French dominance in the Mediterranean and open new routes to India. I assembled not just an army, but an entire expedition of scholars, scientists, and artists. We would conquer Egypt not just militarily, but intellectually, bringing the light of French civilization to the land of the pharaohs. The early victories were intoxicating. We defeated the Mameluke armies at the Battle of the Pyramids, and I stood before my soldiers with ancient monuments as witnesses, declaring that 40 centuries looked down upon you. Cairo fell, Alexandria was secured, and it seemed that my reputation for invincibility would extend from the sands of Egypt to the salons of Paris. Then reality delivered its harsh lessons. Admiral Nelson destroyed our fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding us in a land that was increasingly hostile. Our supply lines were cut, diseases ravaged our ranks, and what had begun as a glorious expedition began to look like an elaborate trap. The local population, initially curious about these French liberators, grew resentful of occupiers who demanded too much and delivered too little. For the first time in my career, I faced the possibility of genuine failure, not the temporary setbacks that could be overcome with better tactics or more determination, but the kind of comprehensive defeat that destroys reputations and ends careers. Many of my officers began to speak privately of finding ways to negotiate their return to France, to salvage what they could from this disaster. But in those dark months in Egypt, I discovered something profound about the nature of limiting beliefs. The most dangerous limitations aren't imposed by others, they're the ones we impose on ourselves when we decide that a setback means we're not meant to succeed. I could have accepted that Egypt proved I had overreached, that my ambitions had exceeded my capabilities, that perhaps I should be content with the victories I had already achieved. Instead, I chose to see Egypt differently. Yes, we were cut off from France and facing increasing resistance, but we were also in a position to accomplish something that no European power had managed: to genuinely understand this ancient civilization and to forge a new relationship between East and West. The Rosetta Stone that our scholars discovered wasn't just an archaeological artifact. It was a symbol of how apparent failure can unlock discoveries more valuable than the original objective. I used our isolation as an opportunity for education rather than dwelling on it as evidence of failure. I studied Islamic law and culture with the same intensity I had once applied to artillery tactics. I engaged with local scholars and religious leaders, learning that conquest without understanding is merely temporary dominance. I began to see that true victory requires not just defeating your enemies, but comprehending the forces that shape their world. When plague struck our army at Jaffa, I faced the ultimate test of leadership in crisis. I could have maintained safe distance from the infected, as military protocol demanded. Instead, I walked among the plague victims, touching the sick, to demonstrate that fear would not govern my decisions. My officers thought I was risking my life needlessly, but I understood that leadership in desperate circumstances requires visible courage rather than prudent caution. The Syrian campaign that followed taught me even more about reframing failure. We won battles but couldn't take Acre, and eventually I had to make the decision that would define my entire understanding of strategic retreat. Rather than continuing a siege that would destroy my army, I chose to preserve our forces for future opportunities. My enemies called this abandonment, my critics called it defeat, but I had learned to measure success differently. Sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to stop fighting one battle so you can win the war. Sometimes apparent retreat is actually strategic repositioning for a more decisive engagement. When I finally left Egypt, many saw it as the end of my meteoric rise. What they didn't understand was that Egypt had taught me lessons that would make my future victories possible. I had learned to adapt to circumstances beyond my control, to find opportunity in isolation, to lead through genuine crisis rather than just tactical challenges. Most importantly, I had destroyed the limiting belief that setbacks indicate destiny. Egypt taught me that failure is only final if you accept it as such, that every defeat contains the seeds of future victory if you're intelligent enough to plant them properly. The expedition that appeared to be my first major failure became the foundation for everything I would accomplish afterward. I returned from Egypt to find France in chaos, military defeats on multiple fronts, economic instability, political paralysis, and a directory that had lost the confidence of both the people and the army. The natural response would have been to wait for the situation to stabilize, to seek a traditional path back to prominence through proper channels and patient advancement. But Egypt had taught me that waiting for perfect conditions is often just a sophisticated form of surrender. The limiting belief that it's not my turn yet had died in the desert sands, along with so many other illusions about how power actually works. I realized that in times of crisis, authority flows to those bold enough to seize it, not to those polite enough to wait for it to be offered. The conspiracy that would become the coup of 18 Brumaire began with a simple recognition. France needed decisive leadership, and the existing system was incapable of providing it. But more personally, I understood that my own destiny would not be decided by committees or determined by seniority. If I wanted to shape the future of France, and my own future, I would have to act rather than wait for permission. The planning required delicate coordination with political figures like Abbé Sieyès and my brother Lucien. But the moment of truth came when I had to walk into the Council of 500 and essentially declare that the old system was finished. These were elected representatives of the French Republic, men who had every legal right to their positions and every reason to resist a military officer's interference in civilian government. As I entered that chamber, I could feel the weight of centuries of tradition, the accumulated authority of republican institutions, the presumption that soldiers should obey civilian leadership rather than replace it. Everything in the established order suggested that what I was attempting was not just illegal, but fundamentally wrong. But I had learned something crucial about the nature of authority. It exists only as long as people believe in it. The Directory commanded respect only because people accepted their right to command. The moment enough people stopped believing in that authority, it would cease to exist regardless of its legal foundations. The initial moments were chaotic and dangerous. Several deputies shouted accusations of treason. Others called for my arrest. And for a few critical minutes, it appeared that the coup might collapse before it had truly begun. This was the moment when many men would have retreated, apologized, and tried to salvage their careers within the existing system. Instead, I doubled down on audacity. When they questioned my authority to address them, I reminded them of my service to France. When they accused me of military ambition, I spoke of the nation's need for stability. When they threatened legal consequences, I made it clear that I was prepared to accept any outcome rather than watch France continue its descent into chaos. The breakthrough came when I realized that most of the opposition was based on fear rather than principle. These politicians weren't defending the Directory because they believed in its effectiveness. They were protecting it because they feared the uncertainty that would follow its collapse. Once I could demonstrate that controlled change was preferable to continued deterioration, resistance began to crumble. My brother Lucien's support proved crucial, but the decisive factor was my willingness to stake everything on a single moment of absolute commitment. There comes a point in every ambitious undertaking where you must choose between the safety of retreat and the risk of total commitment. One chose commitment, and that choice transformed not just my circumstances, but my entire understanding of how power actually works. The coup succeeded not because it was perfectly planned, but because it was executed with complete conviction at precisely the right moment. I learned that timing and determination often matter more than preparation and permission. Sometimes the greatest risk is waiting for conditions to become more favorable, rather than acting decisively when opportunity presents itself. When the dust settled and I emerged as first consul, I had destroyed one of the most persistent limiting beliefs in human society, that you must wait for others to give you permission to lead. True leadership often requires taking authority rather than receiving it, demonstrating capability rather than merely claiming it. The proclamation of 18 Brumaire wasn't just a political document. It was my declaration that limiting beliefs die hard, but they do die when confronted with sufficient courage and conviction. I had refused to accept that my turn hadn't come, that I was too young for supreme authority, that military officers shouldn't challenge civilian leadership, that established systems deserved preservation simply because they were established. From that moment forward, I understood that the most important battles are often fought against the limitations we place on ourselves. External obstacles are real, but they become insurmountable only when we accept them as permanent. The coup taught me that audacity succeeds where caution fails, and that sometimes you must be willing to risk everything you have achieved to become everything you're capable of becoming. As first consul, I faced a France fractured by decades of revolution, where old systems had been destroyed but nothing coherent had been built to replace them. The country desperately needed new laws, new institutions, new ways of organizing society that could unite rather than divide. But more personally, I needed to create a system that would destroy forever the limiting beliefs that had held back people like me, those born without noble blood but burning with noble ambition. The creation of what would become known as the Napoleonic Code wasn't just a legal exercise. It was my declaration of war against the limiting belief that your birth determines your possibilities. For centuries, French society had operated on the assumption that some people were inherently superior to others, that rights and opportunities should be distributed according to bloodline rather than merit. I remember the long nights in the Council of State, arguing with lawyers and legal scholars who wanted to preserve elements of the old system. They spoke eloquently about tradition, about the wisdom of established hierarchies, about the dangers of too much social mobility. What they were really defending was a world where accident of birth mattered more than strength of character. My vision was radically different. I wanted laws that would apply equally to every French citizen, regardless of whether they descended from peasants or princes. I insisted on legal equality, on careers open to talent, on merit as the primary basis for advancement in government service. These weren't just abstract principles, they were personal convictions born from my own experience of fighting against a system designed to keep me in my place. The resistance was enormous. Established families who had enjoyed privileges for generations suddenly faced a world where their children would have to compete on equal terms with the sons of blacksmiths and bakers. Legal traditionalists argued that hierarchy was natural, that some people were simply born to rule, while others were born to obey. But I had learned something crucial about the nature of systems. They exist to serve those who created them, and they persist only as long as people accept their legitimacy. The old legal system wasn't based on justice or efficiency, it was based on the need to preserve existing power structures. By creating new laws based on merit rather than inheritance, I wasn't just reforming society, was giving legal force to the principle that every person should be the architect of their own destiny. The code established principles that seem obvious now but were revolutionary then. Equal treatment under law, regardless of social class. The right to own property and pass it on to your children. Marriage as a civil contract rather than just a religious ceremony. The presumption that talent and effort should determine advancement, rather than family connections. Each provision was a deliberate assault on a specific limiting belief. When we established that all citizens could aspire to any position for which they were qualified, we destroyed the belief that certain careers were reserved for certain classes. When we made education and advancement based on merit, we eliminated the assumption that intelligence and capability were distributed according to bloodline. But creating laws was only the beginning. The real challenge was implementing them in a society where old habits and assumptions died hard. I had to demonstrate through my own appointments that I meant what I wrote. I promoted officers based on battlefield performance rather than aristocratic connections. I appointed ministers based on competence rather than family influence. I created a new nobility, the Legion of Honor based entirely on service to France, rather than inherited status. This wasn't just about fairness, it was about unleashing human potential. When you remove artificial barriers to advancement, when you create systems that reward merit over inheritance, you discover capabilities in people that hierarchical societies never allow to develop. Some of my most effective generals came from the lowest social ranks, men who would never have had opportunities under the old system. The code became my most enduring achievement, because it didn't just change laws, it changed how people thought about their own possibilities. Suddenly, a farmer's son could realistically aspire to become a judge. A merchant's daughter could marry into any family based on love rather than social calculation, and talent could find expression regardless of its social origins. I learned that destroying limiting beliefs often requires changing not just individual mindsets, but the systems and structures that reinforce those beliefs. You can tell people they're equal all you want, but until the laws treat them as equals, until the institutions provide equal opportunities, until the society rewards merit over inheritance, those limiting beliefs will persist. The Napoleonic Code became the foundation for legal systems around the world because it embodied a simple but powerful principle: your potential should be limited only by your effort and ability, never by circumstances you didn't choose. When you create systems based on this principle, you don't just change laws, you change the fundamental assumptions that shape how people see themselves. and what they believe they can achieve. Every time someone rises from humble origins to achieve greatness, every time merit triumphs over inherited privilege, every time talent finds recognition regardless of its social packaging, they're benefiting from principles I fought to establish in those late-night sessions with legal scholars who thought they were just writing laws. Asterisk, asterisk, on December 2nd, 1804, in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, I performed an act that destroyed the ultimate limiting belief about authority and legitimacy. When Pope Pius VII reached for the crown to place it upon my head, I took it from his hands and crowned myself Emperor of the French. In that single gesture, I declared that no one, not the Church, not hereditary nobility, not ancient tradition, had the right to define my worth or determine my authority. The symbolism of that moment went far beyond personal ambition. For over 1,000 years, European rulers had received their crowns from religious authorities, acknowledging that their power came from divine appointment rather than personal merit. By crowning myself, I was announcing that authority comes from capability and achievement, not from the blessing of institutions that derive their own power from the perpetuation of limiting beliefs. The planning for that coronation required delicate negotiations with the Vatican. Pope Pius had agreed to participate, but under the traditional assumption that he would perform the actual crowning, thereby legitimizing my rule through religious authority. What he didn't understand was that I had no intention of suggesting that my authority derived from any source other than my own achievements and the support of the French people. As I stood before that altar, surrounded by the representatives of European nobility, who had spent their lives believing that royal blood was a prerequisite for imperial authority, I was acutely aware that I was about to shatter their most fundamental assumption about how power works. Many of them had initially dismissed me as an upstart general who would eventually be replaced by a legitimate ruler. The coronation was my declaration that legitimacy belonged to whoever could earn it, not to whoever inherited it. The moment I lifted that crown, I could feel the shock ripple through the cathedral. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. Emperors were supposed to acknowledge higher authorities, to accept that their power was granted rather than seized, to maintain the fiction that some people were born to rule while others were born to serve. But I had learned something during my rise from Corsican artillery officer to master of Europe. The most powerful limiting beliefs are the ones that convince people to seek permission for things they have the capability to achieve on their own. The traditional coronation ceremony was really just an elaborate ritual designed to maintain the belief that authority must be granted by existing power structures rather than earned through competence and achievement. When I placed that crown on my own head, I wasn't just becoming emperor, I was demonstrating a principle that threatened every hierarchy based on inherited privilege. If a man could crown himself emperor through merit and achievement, what other supposedly sacred limitations might prove to be nothing more than convenient fictions? The reaction from European monarchs was immediate and intense. They understood instinctively that my example posed an existential threat to their entire worldview. If people began to believe that authority should be based on capability rather than bloodline, if they started demanding that leadership be earned rather than inherited, the entire structure of European society would be at risk. But that was precisely my intention. The coronation wasn't just about establishing my personal authority. It was about establishing a new principle of legitimacy based on merit rather than birth. I wanted every person with talent and ambition to see that the barriers they had been taught to respect were actually just conventions that could be challenged and overcome. Josephine's coronation as empress carried its own revolutionary message. Here was a woman born to the minor nobility of Martinique, who had survived the terror and divorce, being crowned as empress not because of her royal blood. She had none but because of her intelligence, grace, and partnership with someone who had earned imperial authority through achievement. The ceremony itself was a careful balance between honoring tradition and establishing new principles. We used the cathedral, the religious setting, the formal protocols that people expected, but we transformed their meaning. Instead of a ritual that reinforced existing hierarchies, it became a demonstration that hierarchies could be restructured based on merit rather than inheritance. One chose to wear ancient imperial regalia, not to suggest continuity with previous empires, but to demonstrate that the symbols of authority belonged to whoever had the strength and wisdom to claim them. The crown, the scepter, the imperial robes, these weren't magical objects that conferred legitimacy. They were symbols that derived their meaning from the capabilities of whoever possessed them. Years later, when other European rulers finally acknowledged my imperial title, they weren't just recognizing my personal authority, they were accepting a new principle about how authority could be legitimately established. Merit, achievement, and popular support had been recognized as valid foundations for imperial power, challenging centuries of assumption about divine right and inherited nobility. The coronation taught me that sometimes the most powerful way to destroy a limiting belief is to act as if it simply doesn't exist. Instead of arguing about whether someone like me deserved to be emperor, instead of seeking permission from existing authorities, instead of waiting for others to recognize my worthiness, I simply assumed the authority that my achievements had earned and dared others to challenge it. When you refuse to accept other people's definitions of what you're allowed to achieve, when you crown yourself with the recognition you've earned rather than waiting for others to grant it, you don't just advance your own cause, you demonstrate for everyone watching that the limitations they've accepted as permanent might be nothing more than habits that can be broken with sufficient courage and conviction. Asterisk, building an empire requires more than brilliant strategy and personal ambition. It requires transforming ordinary people into extraordinary performers, convincing them that they're capable of achievements they never imagined possible. The Grande Armée became my laboratory for destroying the most persistent limiting belief of all, that average people can't accomplish extraordinary things. When I assembled what would become the most formidable military force in European history, I wasn't working with superhuman material. These were farmers, sons, shopkeepers, apprentices, village craftsmen, men who had been told their entire lives that greatness was reserved for their social superiors. My challenge was to help them see themselves as I saw them, as potential heroes waiting for the right circumstances to reveal their capabilities. The transformation began with symbols. Every regiment carried an eagle standard that represented not just military unit identification, but imperial purpose and personal honor. When I presented these eagles to my regiments, I told them they were receiving symbols that would carry them to victory across Europe. But more importantly, I was giving them permission to see themselves as worthy of carrying such symbols. These weren't just motivational speeches, they were systematic efforts to destroy the limiting beliefs that had convinced these men they were destined for ordinary lives. I spoke to them about glory, about honor, about the immortality that comes from extraordinary achievement. I made it clear that their social origins didn't disqualify them from greatness. They simply meant that their greatness would be entirely self-made. The genius of the Grande Armée wasn't superior weapons or revolutionary tactics, it was the shared belief that every soldier was capable of heroic performance. I created a culture where courage was expected, excellence was demanded, and extraordinary achievement was treated as normal rather than exceptional. This required destroying several dangerous limiting beliefs that had plagued armies throughout history. First, the belief that common soldiers couldn't be trusted with initiative. I encouraged my men to think for themselves, to adapt to circumstances, to take responsibility for outcomes rather than simply following orders blindly. Second, the belief that military success required perfect conditions. The Grande Armée became famous for achieving victory despite supply shortages, numerical disadvantages, and hostile terrain. My soldiers learned that limitations were problems to solve, rather than excuses for failure. Third, the belief that individual effort didn't matter in large organizations. I instituted a merit-based promotion system where any soldier could rise to become a Marshal of France based on battlefield performance. This wasn't just about fairness, it was about ensuring that every man understood his personal efforts could dramatically change his circumstances. The most powerful tool I used was personal recognition. I made it a practice to know the names and backgrounds of soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle. When I encountered veterans of specific campaigns, I would ask about their experiences, remember their contributions, and acknowledge their role in our shared victories. This personal attention had a transformative effect. Suddenly, men who had spent their lives being ignored by authority figures found themselves recognized and valued by the emperor himself. They began to see themselves differently, not as replaceable parts in a military machine, but as individual contributors to a historic enterprise. I learned that destroying limiting beliefs in groups requires creating new stories about what's possible. Instead of allowing my soldiers to think of themselves as peasants temporarily dressed as warriors, I encouraged them to see themselves as the inheritors of ancient military traditions, as worthy successors to the armies of Alexander and Caesar. The esprit de corps that developed in the Grande Armée became legendary because it was based on genuine mutual respect and shared purpose rather than mere discipline and obedience. These men fought with extraordinary courage, not because they feared punishment for cowardice, but because they believed their cause was worthy and their comrades deserved their best efforts. The promotion of men like Marshal Murat, who began as the son of an innkeeper, and Marshal Ney, the son of a barrel maker, sent a clear message throughout the ranks. Extraordinary achievement was not only possible, but expected. Every private could look at these marshals and see proof that the limiting beliefs about social destiny could be completely overcome. This philosophy extended beyond military matters. I encouraged my soldiers to see themselves as representatives of French civilization, as carriers of Enlightenment principles to the rest of Europe. They weren't just conquering territory, they were spreading ideas about human potential and social possibility that would outlast any military victory. The Grande Armée's greatest battles were won before they began, in the minds of soldiers who had been convinced that they were capable of impossible things. When men believe they're destined for greatness, when they've internalized the conviction that their efforts matter and their sacrifices have meaning, they perform at levels that surprise even themselves. I discovered that shared purpose is the most powerful destroyer of individual limitations. When people believe they're part of something larger than themselves, when they understand that their personal success contributes to collective achievement, they transcend their previous assumptions about their own capabilities. The eagles that led the Grande Armée into battle weren't just military standards, they were symbols of transformed human potential. Proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they were given worthy challenges, proper recognition, and permission to see themselves as capable of greatness. Asterisk, December 2nd, 1805. Exactly 1 year after my coronation dawned cold and foggy near the village of Austerlitz, in what is now the Czech Republic. As the first surveyed the battlefield where I would face the combined armies of Austria and Russia, commanded by emperors who considered me an upstart pretender, I understood that this battle would determine not just military outcomes, but whether merit could definitively triumph over inherited privilege. The situation appeared hopeless to conventional military thinking. The enemy forces outnumbered my Grande Armée significantly. They held the high ground that military doctrine considered essential for victory, and they were commanded by experienced generals who had studied every battle I had ever fought. According To every established principle of warfare, I should have retreated or sought terms rather than accepting battle under such disadvantageous conditions. But I had learned something crucial about the relationship between limitation and opportunity. What appears to be your greatest disadvantage often contains the seeds of your most decisive victory. The enemy's superior numbers made them confident, their better position made them predictable, and their knowledge of my previous tactics made them assume they understood what I would do next. I spent weeks before the battle, deliberately creating the impression of weakness. I abandoned the strategic Pratzen Heights, allowing the Allied armies to occupy the high ground they considered essential for victory. I withdrew my forces in apparent disorder, sending messages that could be intercepted, suggesting that I was desperately seeking a way to avoid battle. I even requested a meeting with the Austrian Emperor, playing the role of a commander who realized he was trapped and seeking terms. Every action was designed to reinforce their limiting belief about what was possible in this situation. They were convinced that superior numbers and better positioning guaranteed victory, that my previous successes had been flukes that wouldn't work against properly prepared enemies, that this battle would prove once and for all that military genius was no match for overwhelming force properly applied. The night before the battle, I walked among my soldiers, and I could feel their nervous energy. They trusted me, but they could see the enemy campfires covering the hills around us like stars in the darkness. Many of them understood that tomorrow would test everything we had built together, that the reputation of the Grande Armée and the legitimacy of my empire would be decided by how well we could perform when the odds seemed insurmountable. I spoke to them that night about the anniversary, how exactly 1 year ago I had crowned myself emperor, and now we would prove whether that crown was earned through genuine capability or mere ambition. I told them that tomorrow's sun would witness either our greatest triumph or our final defeat, and that either outcome would depend entirely on whether we could execute a plan that violated every conventional assumption about how battles should be fought. The Allied plan was predictable because it was based on orthodox military thinking. They would use their superior numbers to envelop my flanks while maintaining pressure on my center, forcing me to fight a defensive battle that would inevitably end in my defeat. What they didn't anticipate was that I had no intention of fighting the battle they expected. At dawn, the sun broke through the fog with a brilliance that my soldiers later called the Sun of Austerlitz. As the enemy descended from the Pratzen Heights to execute their flanking maneuver, I launched the most audacious gamble of my military career. While they were advancing to attack my flanks, I sent Marshal Soult's corps directly up the heights they had just abandoned, cutting their army in half and seizing the commanding position they had foolishly vacated. The execution required perfect timing and absolute trust between me and my subordinates. If Soult's attack had been launched too early or too late, if my other corps hadn't maintained their positions exactly as planned, if the enemy had recognized what was happening and responded quickly enough, the entire Grande Armée could have been destroyed. But everything worked precisely as I had envisioned. Within hours, the Allied army was broken into fragments. Their superior numbers turned into a liability as separated units stumbled into each other in confusion. The emperors of Austria and Russia, who had awakened that morning expecting to dictate terms to a defeated pretender, found themselves fleeing the battlefield as their carefully planned offensive collapsed into chaotic retreat. The victory was complete and decisive, but more importantly, it was a demonstration that innovative thinking could overcome any material disadvantage. I had taken everything the enemy considered their timbers, position, experience, and turned it into weakness through superior strategy and perfect execution. Austerlitz proved that the limiting belief, "you can't win against superior numbers," was just another assumption waiting to be shattered by someone willing to fight the battle differently than everyone expected. The enemy had more soldiers, but I had a better plan. They had better positions, but I had better timing. They had traditional advantages, but I had innovative approaches that made their advantages irrelevant. The aftermath of Austerlitz transformed the political landscape of Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed for over 800 years, dissolved within months. The coalition against France collapsed as each member sought separate peace terms. Most importantly, the victory established conclusively that merit-based leadership could defeat hereditary authority when the stakes were highest. That sun that rose over Austerlitz became my symbol because it represented the moment when everything became clear, when fog lifted both literally and metaphorically, revealing opportunities that had been hidden by conventional assumptions. Every time I faced seemingly impossible odds afterward, I remembered that dawn when perfect preparation met perfect opportunity, and the impossible became inevitable. Asterisk, after Austerlitz, I controlled most of continental Europe, but Britain remained beyond my reach, protected by the Royal Navy and sustained by global commerce that seemed impossible to interrupt. Every advisor told me that economic warfare against an island nation with worldwide trade networks was futile, that you simply couldn't fight the established order of global commerce with continental resources alone. The continental system, as my economic blockade came to be known, was born from my refusal to accept the limiting belief that you can't fight the system. Britain's power wasn't just military, it was economic, built on trade networks that had developed over centuries and seemed as permanent as natural law. But I had learned that seemingly permanent systems are often more fragile than they appear, especially when someone is willing to challenge their fundamental assumptions. The plan was audacious in its scope. Close every European port to British goods, force the continent to become economically self-sufficient, and strangle Britain's economy until they sued for peace. It meant confronting not just British power, but the entire structure of international commerce that had enriched merchants, bankers, and governments across Europe for generations. The resistance was immediate and intense. Port cities that had prospered from British trade saw their economies collapse overnight. Merchants who had built fortunes on colonial goods found themselves forced to choose between compliance with my system and commercial survival. Even my own allies questioned whether the economic disruption was worth the potential political gains. But I understood something about power that my critics missed. Economic systems, like political systems, exist only as long as people accept them as inevitable. British commercial dominance wasn't a law of nature. It was a human creation that could be challenged by someone willing to offer an alternative and enforce it consistently. The Berlin Decree that formally established the continental system wasn't just an economic policy. It was my declaration that the existing order of global commerce could be reshaped through will and determination. Every British merchant ship turned away from a European port. Every colonial cargo rejected at customs. Every commercial contract cancelled in favor of continental alternatives was a small victory in a war most people didn't even realize we were fighting. The implementation required transforming the entire mentality of European commerce. Instead of accepting dependence on British goods and colonial imports, continental manufacturers had to develop their own capabilities. French industry expanded to fill gaps left by British products. German states discovered they could produce goods they had previously imported, and new trade networks developed to replace British commercial connections. This wasn't just about hurting British interests. It was about proving that economic independence was possible for those willing to endure short-term sacrifice for long-term advantage. The limiting belief that we need what they're selling began to crumble as European producers demonstrated that alternatives could be developed when necessity demanded innovation. The blockade's success varied, but its psychological impact was profound. For the first time, British merchants and manufacturers faced the possibility that their global commercial empire might not be permanent. Markets they had dominated for generations suddenly became inaccessible, forcing them to seek new opportunities and accept reduced profits. More importantly, the continental system demonstrated that economic warfare was possible on a scale no one had previously imagined. By coordinating the commercial policies of multiple nations, by creating unified resistance to British trade, I had shown that economic power could be challenged just as effectively as military power. The personal cost was enormous. Enforcing the blockade required constant vigilance, complicated diplomacy, and occasional military intervention against allies who found compliance too economically painful. The war in Spain began largely because of Portuguese refusal to honor the continental system, and the eventual invasion of Russia was precipitated partly by Tsar Alexander's decision to resume trade with Britain. But even when the system eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and the military defeats that weakened my ability to enforce it, it had accomplished something unprecedented. It had proven that global economic systems could be challenged and restructured by someone with sufficient will and resources. The continental system taught me that fighting the system requires more than just opposing it. You must offer a viable alternative. You can't simply destroy existing arrangements without providing something better to replace them. The blockade worked when continental Europe could develop its own industries and trade networks, but failed when those alternatives proved inadequate to meet all economic needs. I learned that some battles are worth fighting even when victory seems impossible, because the act of fighting changes how people think about what's possible. Even though the continental system ultimately failed to bring Britain to its knees, it demonstrated that their commercial supremacy wasn't invulnerable, that their global networks could be disrupted, that their economic power could be challenged. The Berlin Decree became my symbol for thinking bigger than the problem in front of you. When faced with British naval supremacy that seemed impossible to overcome, instead of accepting limitation, I created an entirely new form of warfare that forced the enemy to fight on ground they hadn't chosen, using weapons they hadn't anticipated. Every entrepreneur who challenges an established industry, every innovator who creates alternatives to existing systems, every person who refuses to accept that this is just how things work is applying principles I established with the continental system, that apparently permanent arrangements can be changed by those willing to think comprehensively and act decisively. Spain was supposed to be a simple operation: install my brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, integrate the Iberian Peninsula into the continental system, and secure France's southern border while extending my influence across yet another European kingdom. Instead, it became the Spanish ulcer that would drain French resources and teach me the most painful lesson of my career, that success itself can become the most dangerous limiting belief of all. When I entered Spain in 1808, I carried with me the confidence of a man who had reshaped the map of Europe through a combination of military genius and political innovation. Every previous campaign had ended in victory. Every seeming obstacle had been overcome through superior strategy and decisive action. I had begun to believe my own legend that Napoleon Bonaparte could solve any problem through the application of will and intelligence. The initial stages reinforced this confidence. Spanish regular armies collapsed before the Grande Army with the same predictability I had come to expect from conventional opponents. Madrid fell. The Spanish royal family was replaced with French leadership, and the administrative structure of the Spanish state was reorganized according to principles that had worked successfully throughout the rest of my empire. But something was different about Spanish resistance. Instead of accepting defeat after their armies were destroyed and their capital occupied, the Spanish people began fighting a different kind of war entirely. They refused to acknowledge that military victory meant political submission, that the conquest of their institutions meant the conquest of their will. The guerrilla warfare that erupted across Spain violated every assumption I had developed about how conquered populations should behave. These weren't organized military units that could be defeated in decisive battles. They were ordinary citizens who melted into the countryside after striking at French supply lines, communications, and isolated garrisons. Every French patrol became a potential target. Every supply convoy required heavy escort. Every occupied town remained hostile territory, regardless of how long we controlled it. The Spanish had discovered something I hadn't anticipated, that a people determined to resist could make occupation more costly than conquest. That controlling territory didn't necessarily mean controlling the population that lived there. For the first time in my career, I encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through better tactics or more concentrated force. The guerrilla fighters weren't challenging me to battles I could win. They were forcing me to fight a kind of war where traditional military superiority became irrelevant. This was my introduction to the limiting belief that had been growing within my own mind, that previous success guaranteed future success, that the methods which had worked before would work again, that my strategic genius could overcome any obstacle. Spain taught me that this kind of thinking was not confidence, but arrogance, not strength, but blindness. The Spanish resistance succeeded because they understood something about warfare that I had forgotten in my string of conventional victories, that the strongest armies can be defeated by enemies who refuse to fight on terms that favor strength. The guerrillas turned my advantages into liabilities. My supply lines became vulnerabilities. My need for communication became opportunities for attack. My conventional military thinking became predictable patterns they could exploit. I began to recognize the symptoms of what I now understand as success-induced limitation. Because my previous approaches had worked so well, I had stopped questioning them, stopped adapting them, stopped considering that different situations might require entirely different methods. I had become trapped by my own expertise. The financial cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of French troops tied down in occupation duties, constant drain on imperial resources, growing resistance throughout Europe as other populations saw that French power could be challenged successfully. But the psychological cost was even greater. The realization that invincibility was itself a form of vulnerability. The Spanish experience forced me to confront the difference between confidence and arrogance. Confidence comes from understanding your capabilities and applying them effectively to appropriate challenges. Arrogance comes from assuming that your capabilities are universal, that what worked in one situation will work in all situations, that past success eliminates the need for continued adaptation. I learned that every strength can become a weakness when circumstances change. The rapid movement and concentrated force that had won battles across Europe became liabilities when fighting an enemy that refused to mass for decisive engagement. The administrative efficiency that had integrated conquered territories became irrelevant when the population rejected the legitimacy of any imposed government. Most painfully, I discovered that the belief in my own invincibility had become a limiting factor in my strategic thinking. Instead of approaching Spain with the careful analysis I had applied to earlier campaigns, I had assumed that French military superiority would overcome Spanish resistance automatically. I had stopped doing the intellectual work that had made my previous victories possible. The guerrilla's blade that cut down French soldiers in Spanish ambushes became my symbol for a crucial insight: that apparent weakness can defeat apparent strength when the weak refuse to accept the strong's definition of how conflict should be conducted. The Spanish taught me that asymmetric warfare, fighting differently rather than fighting better, could neutralize conventional military advantages. When I finally left Spain to deal with other threats, the Peninsular War continued to drain French resources and demonstrate that my empire had limits. But the education I received there proved invaluable when facing later challenges, because Spain had cured me of the most dangerous limiting belief a successful person can develop: The assumption that what brought you to your current level will automatically take you to the next level. The Spanish lesson remains one of my most important teachings. Success is not a destination, but a process. And the moment you stop adapting, questioning, and growing is the moment you begin to decline. Your greatest victories often contain the seeds of your future defeats, if you allow them to make you complacent rather than more capable. In 1812, I led the largest army in European history across the Niemen River into Russia of 600,000 men from across my empire, marching toward Moscow with the confidence of soldiers who had conquered most of the continent. 6 months later, fewer than 30,000 would recross that same river in retreat. The Russian campaign became my education in the difference between conquering and winning, between taking territory and achieving objectives. The decision to invade Russia grew from my frustration with Tsar Alexander's violations of the continental system and his refusal to support French policies that had reshaped European politics. But deeper than these diplomatic irritations was my belief that one final, decisive campaign would establish French hegemony so completely that Britain would be forced to seek peace and Europe would accept permanent French leadership. I had spent months preparing for this campaign with the same methodical attention to detail that had made previous invasions successful. Supply depots were established across Poland, detailed maps were prepared, contingency plans were developed for every foreseeable challenge. The Grande Army that crossed into Russia was the most perfectly prepared military force I had ever assembled. What I hadn't prepared for was an enemy who refused to fight the war I expected. Instead of defending their border fortresses or offering battle where my superior numbers and artillery could destroy their armies, the Russians implemented a strategy that turned the vastness of their country into a weapon against me. They retreated deeper and deeper into Russia, burning crops and supplies as they withdrew, avoiding decisive engagement while my army grew more extended and vulnerable with every mile we advanced. I kept expecting them to turn and fight, to defend Moscow or St. Petersburg in the kind of battle that had decided previous campaigns. Instead, they led me deeper into a trap I didn't recognize until it was too late. The capture of Moscow should have been the culmination of the campaign. When my advance guard entered the ancient capital of Russia, I expected to dictate terms from the Kremlin as I had from Vienna, Berlin, and Madrid. Instead, I found a nearly empty city that burst into flames shortly after our arrival, destroying the supplies I needed and the political prize I had sought. Sitting in the Kremlin while Moscow burned around me, I finally understood what the Russians had been doing. They weren't fighting to win battles, they were fighting to make victory impossible for me. Every mile I advanced made retreat more difficult. Every day I remained in Russia made my strategic position worse. Every resource I consumed brought me closer to the moment when continued advance would become impossible. This was my introduction to a form of limitation I had never encountered. The limitation that comes from achieving your stated objectives while failing to accomplish your actual purpose. I had wanted to force Russia to submit to French leadership, but conquering Moscow hadn't achieved that goal. I had captured the symbol of Russian power without capturing Russian resistance. The retreat from Moscow became the most devastating education of my career. The same Russian winter that had destroyed other invading armies began to destroy mine. But the cold was less destructive than the realization that I had led my men into a situation where there were no good options, only degrees of disaster. Every day of that retreat taught me something new about the nature of strategic limitation. When your supply lines are too extended, when your objectives are unclear, when your enemy refuses to fight on terms that favor your advantages, military genius becomes irrelevant. Superior tactics can't overcome impossible logistics. Brilliant leadership can't compensate for strategic miscalculation. I learned that some limiting beliefs are actually warnings that should be heeded rather than overcome. The belief that Russia is too vast to conquer wasn't a mental barrier to be destroyed. With strategic wisdom, I should have respected. The assumption that winter campaigns in Russia are impossible wasn't defeatist thinking, it was historical experience. I should have studied more carefully. The burning of Moscow became my symbol for understanding the difference between apparent victory and actual achievement. I had captured the city I sought, but the city's destruction had made that capture meaningless. Sometimes what looks like success is actually elaborate failure, and sometimes apparent obstacles are actually protective warnings. The Russian campaign taught me that confidence must be balanced with humility, that previous success doesn't guarantee future success, that even the most careful preparation can be undermined by fundamental strategic errors. Most importantly, I learned that the greatest limitation isn't external resistance, it's the internal blindness that prevents you from recognizing when you're pursuing objectives that can't actually be achieved. When I finally escaped from Russia and returned to Paris, I brought with me more than the remnants of a defeated army. I brought the knowledge that some battles aren't worth winning, that some victories cost more than defeats, that some forms of success are actually elaborate forms of failure. The flames that consumed Moscow illuminated a truth I had been too successful to see clearly, that the greatest victories sometimes require knowing when not to fight, when not to advance, when not to pursue objectives that will ultimately prove hollow. Real strength sometimes means accepting limitation rather than trying to overcome it, recognizing boundaries rather than trying to destroy them. This wasn't the end of my story, but it was the end of my illusion of invincibility. Russia taught me that even emperors must respect certain limits, that even military genius has boundaries, that even the strongest will can be broken by attempting the impossible. Sometimes the wisest course is not to destroy limiting beliefs, but to understand which limitations are actually wisdom in disguise. When the Allies exiled me to the island of Elba in 1814, they believed they were writing the final chapter of Napoleon Bonaparte's story. A tiny Mediterranean island, barely 10 miles long, populated by iron miners and fishermen. Surely this would contain the ambitions of a man who had once controlled most of Europe. They had accepted the limiting belief that failure is final. That defeat meant permanent elimination from the stage of history. I understood something they had missed. That exile is only a prison if you accept it as such. That apparent endings are often just opportunities for new beginnings. That the most powerful transformations often occur during periods of apparent powerlessness. The first days on Elba were admittedly difficult. After commanding armies and governing nations, I found myself ruler of an island with fewer inhabitants than many Parisian neighborhoods. Former marshals of France had been replaced by local fishermen seeking my attention for harbor improvements and mining disputes. The scope of my daily concerns had shrunk from continental politics to municipal administration. But instead of allowing this reduction in circumstances to diminish my sense of purpose, I chose to see Elba as a laboratory for testing new approaches to leadership and governance. If I could transform this small island, if I could demonstrate that my principles worked even at the smallest scale, then perhaps larger opportunities would follow. I threw myself into the administration of Elba with the same intensity I had once applied to military campaigns. Roads were improved, the iron mines were modernized, new agricultural techniques were introduced, and the island's defenses were strengthened. Every project became practice for future challenges, every improvement a demonstration that exile hadn't diminished my capabilities. My fellow exiles, the handful of loyal officers who had followed me to Elba, initially worried that I was wasting my talents on trivial pursuits. They saw a former emperor concerning himself with road construction and harbor dredging when he should be planning his return to power. What they didn't understand was that these projects were my return to power, proof that I remained capable of transforming whatever circumstances I encountered. The news from France reinforced my conviction that exile was temporary rather than permanent. Louis XVIII, restored to the throne by Allied armies, was proving incapable of uniting a nation that had been transformed by 25 years of revolution and war. The economic problems were mounting, the political divisions were deepening, and many French citizens were beginning to remember my rule with nostalgia rather than resentment. But more importantly, I was using this period of isolation to reflect on the lessons of my previous failures. Russia had taught me about the dangers of overextension. Spain had shown me the limits of conventional military thinking, and the collapse of my empire had demonstrated that political success requires more than military victory. I spent long hours walking the cliffs of Elba, thinking about what I would do differently if given another opportunity. How could I build more durable alliances? How could I create political arrangements that would survive military setbacks? How could I transform temporary military success into permanent political achievement? The exile was also teaching me something profound about the nature of limitation itself. The Allies had tried to limit me geographically, politically, and militarily, but they couldn't limit my intellectual development or my strategic planning. The most important battles were being fought in my mind, where I was developing new approaches to old problems and preparing for opportunities that didn't yet exist. I began to understand that exile, whether imposed by others or chosen voluntarily, can be the most productive period in an ambitious person's life. Removed from the daily demands of power, freed from the need to make immediate decisions, I could think more clearly about long-term objectives and develop more sophisticated approaches to achieving them. The Elba Manifesto that I drafted during this period wasn't just a political document. It was my declaration that exile is just another form of preparation, that apparent defeat can be transformed into eventual victory, that limitations imposed by others become opportunities for self-development when approached with the right mindset. Every day on Elba was proving that the limiting belief, failure is final, was just another assumption waiting to be shattered. By someone with sufficient patience and determination, my enemies had banished me to prevent my return to power. But they had actually given me the time and space necessary to develop new strategies for reclaiming it. The irony wasn't lost on me. By trying to end my story, they had given me the opportunity to write new chapters. By attempting to limit my influence, they had created conditions that would make my eventual return more dramatic and effective. By accepting that my exile was permanent, they had stopped watching carefully enough to prevent my escape as I planned. My return to France, I realized that exile had transformed me in ways that continued success might not have accomplished. I had learned patience, developed humility, gained perspective on my previous mistakes, and most importantly, proven to myself that my capabilities weren't dependent on external circumstances. The limiting belief that it's too late was about to be destroyed by a man who had used apparent finality as preparation for new beginning. Exile hadn't ended my story, it had simply provided the interval necessary for writing better chapters, for developing more sophisticated approaches, for returning with wisdom that previous experience alone couldn't have provided. When I finally escaped from Elba and landed on French soil, I would carry with me more than military experience and political ambition. I would carry the knowledge that no limitation is permanent unless you accept it as such, that every ending contains the potential for new beginning, that exile is only imprisonment if you allow it to imprison your imagination along with your body. On March 1st, 1815, I landed on the beach near Cannes with fewer than 1,000 men, facing a France where King Louis XVIII commanded armies, totaling over 200,000 soldiers and the support of European powers that had spent millions to keep me in exile. According to every rational calculation, my return was doomed to end in immediate capture and permanent imprisonment. Instead, it became the most dramatic demonstration in history that comebacks are possible against any odds when you understand the difference between external power and internal loyalty. The proclamation of return that I issued upon landing wasn't just a political announcement, it was my declaration that limiting beliefs die hard, but they do die when confronted with sufficient courage and conviction. Every person who had accepted that you only get one chance was about to see that assumption shattered by someone who refused to accept that failure was final. The march from Cannes to Paris became a masterpiece of psychological warfare rather than military conquest. Instead of fighting my way back to power, I relied on something more powerful than armies: the loyalty and affection I had earned during my years as emperor. Each regiment sent to arrest me instead joined my cause. Each general ordered to stop me instead offered his services. At Lafri near Grenoble, I faced the crucial test. A battalion of soldiers blocked my path, muskets loaded and aimed at the small group of followers who had accompanied me from Elba. This was the moment when rational calculation suggested I should surrender, when overwhelming odds recommended retreat, when common sense indicated that my gamble had failed. Instead, I walked alone toward those loaded muskets, opened my coat to expose my chest, and declared, "If there is one among you who wishes to kill his emperor, here I am." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it contained the transformation of everything. These soldiers, who had been ordered to arrest me, threw down their weapons and shouted "Vive l'Empereur" as they rushed to join my cause. That moment at Lafri encapsulated everything I had learned about destroying limiting beliefs. Physical force is powerful, but emotional connection is stronger. Legal authority matters, but earned loyalty matters more. Numbers are important, but conviction is decisive. The soldiers who joined me weren't choosing between competing military forces. They were choosing between the life they had been told to accept and the life they remembered was possible. The march continued with increasing momentum. City after city opened its gates without resistance. Regiment after regiment abandoned the Bourbon cause. Marshal after marshal declared their renewed allegiance to the empire. What had begun as the desperate gamble of an exiled leader became an unstoppable wave of popular support that swept away every obstacle between me and Paris. King Louis XVIII fled during the night as I approached the capital, abandoning the throne he had held for less than a year. When I entered the Tuileries Palace on March 20th, exactly 100 days after my exile began, I had accomplished something that every expert had declared impossible. I had reclaimed an empire through force of personality rather than force of arms. The 100 days proved that the limiting belief "you only get one chance" is just another assumption that crumbles when tested by someone with absolute determination. Every person who has ever been told their moment has passed, every dreamer who has been informed that their opportunity is gone, every ambitious individual who has been convinced that failure eliminates future possibilities, they all received proof that comebacks are not only possible but inevitable. When you refuse to accept other people's definitions of finality, but the 100 days taught me something even more profound about the nature of persistence. The same qualities that made my return possible: loyalty, determination, refusal to accept defeat, so created the conditions that would lead to Waterloo. My supporters expected immediate action, my enemies mobilized for final confrontation, and the political situation demanded military solutions that might not have been necessary with more time and patience. I learned that successful comebacks require not just the courage to attempt them, but the wisdom to manage them once they succeed. Regaining power is different from wielding it effectively. Returning to a position is different from advancing beyond where you were before. And second chances are only valuable if you've learned how to avoid repeating previous mistakes. The European Powers that had celebrated my exile now faced their worst nightmare. Napoleon Bonaparte, back on the throne of France, commanding renewed loyalty from his people and his army. The coalition against me reformed immediately, bringing together forces that had been arguing among themselves just weeks before. My return had unified my enemies just as effectively as it had rallied my supporters. As I prepared for what would become the Waterloo campaign, I understood that the 100 Days had already achieved something more important than political victory. It had demonstrated that apparently permanent limitations can be temporary setbacks, that public defeat doesn't require private surrender, that the game isn't over until you stop playing. The proclamation of return became my symbol for refusing to accept other people's timelines for your life. When the world tells you your moment has passed, when experts explain why your situation is hopeless, when common sense suggests that persistence is futile, that's often exactly when breakthrough becomes possible for those who refuse to accept external definitions of their possibilities. Every entrepreneur who launches a second company after the first one fails, every artist who continues creating after being rejected, every person who rebuilds after losing everything, they're all applying principles I demonstrated during the 100 Days. That failure is only final if you accept it as such. That comebacks are possible when you understand what really motivates people. That the most powerful limitation is often the one that exists only in your own mind. Asterisk, June 18th, 1815. Near the village of Waterloo in Belgium, I faced the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army in what would be my final battle as Emperor of the French. As I surveyed the battlefield that morning, I understood that this engagement would determine not just the fate of my empire, but the ultimate meaning of everything I had achieved. By evening, I would learn the most profound lesson of my entire career, that some battles are won by losing them, and that true victory often comes disguised as defeat. The campaign that led to Waterloo had begun brilliantly. I had managed to separate the Allied armies, defeat the Prussians at Ligny, and position myself to destroy Wellington's forces before they could be reinforced. Every tactical decision had worked according to plan. Every strategic calculation had proven correct, and victory seemed assured if I could deliver one final, decisive blow. But Waterloo taught me something I had never fully understood, that perfect tactics can be undermined by imperfect execution, that brilliant strategy means nothing if subordinates fail to implement it properly, and that even the greatest military genius is ultimately dependent on factors beyond his direct control. The battle itself unfolded like a slow-motion demonstration of how small failures accumulate into massive disasters. Marshal Ney's premature cavalry charges, Marshal Grouchy's failure to prevent Blücher's return, the delayed start that gave Wellington time to strengthen his positions. Mistake was minor in isolation, but together they created conditions that made victory impossible. As I watched my Imperial Guard veterans, who had never known defeat, break, and retreat from Wellington's Ridge, I experienced something I had never felt before, the absolute certainty that everything I had built was collapsing beyond any possibility of recovery. The men who had followed me across Europe, who had believed in my genius and trusted in my leadership, were fleeing in disorder while enemy cavalry pursued them across the Belgian countryside. The immediate aftermath was chaos. My army disintegrated, my officers abandoned their commands, and my empire ceased to exist within hours of that final repulse. Everything that had seemed permanent just that morning, my authority, my reputation, my destiny, revealed itself as temporary and fragile when tested by absolute defeat. But in the days that followed, as I contemplated abdication and considered my options, I began to understand something profound about the relationship between defeat and victory. Waterloo had destroyed my political power, eliminated my military career, and ended my imperial ambitions. But it couldn't touch something more important: the ideas I had planted, the precedents I had established, the proof I had provided that merit could triumph over inheritance, that individuals could reshape their circumstances through will and intelligence. The limiting belief that failure defines you was shattered by the realization that my defeat at Waterloo didn't diminish what I had accomplished at Austerlitz, that losing an empire didn't erase the legal codes I had created, that military failure didn't invalidate the political principles I had championed. I learned that legacy is different from immediate success, that influence often grows stronger after the person who exercised it has left the stage, that ideas can outlive the individuals who originated them. The Napoleon who lost at Waterloo was finished, but the Napoleonic principles that had transformed Europe would continue shaping the world long after my death. This was my introduction to a paradox that few people understand. Sometimes your greatest victory requires accepting your most complete defeat. By losing everything at Waterloo, I was freed from the burden of maintaining an empire that had become unsustainable. By accepting military failure, I gained the opportunity to focus on intellectual legacy. The letter I would later write to my son contained the essence of this wisdom, that temporary defeat can serve permanent victory if you understand the difference between losing battles and losing wars, between failing in specific attempts and failing as a human being, between being defeated by circumstances and being destroyed by them. Waterloo taught me that the most important victories are often invisible to immediate observers. While my enemies celebrated the defeat of Napoleon the Emperor, they failed to recognize that they had actually ensured the immortality of Napoleon, the symbol. By making me a martyr to their cause of restoration, they had given my ideas a power that successful rule might never have achieved. I understood that some defeats are actually transformations in disguise. The Napoleon who entered the Battle of Waterloo was still thinking like a man who could solve every problem through superior tactics and stronger will. The Napoleon who left that battlefield had learned that some problems can't be solved, only transcended, that some limitations can't be overcome, only accepted with dignity. The wisdom of Waterloo was this: that your final defeat often reveals your ultimate victory, that losing everything you thought you wanted can free you to achieve something you never knew you needed, that the end of one story can be the beginning of a better one. When I walked away from that battlefield, I carried with me something more valuable than any crown or empire: the knowledge that defeat is only failure if you allow it to define you, that setbacks are only permanent if you accept them as such, that the most important battles are fought not for territory or power, but for the legacy you leave and the example you set. The mask that would eventually be made of my face after death became my symbol for this final lesson, that even death cannot destroy what you truly build, that physical defeat cannot touch spiritual victory, that losing everything temporal can be the first step toward gaining something eternal. On St. Helena. During my final years of exile, I had the luxury that had been denied me throughout my meteoric career: time to reflect on what I had actually accomplished, time to understand the difference between temporary achievement and permanent legacy, time to recognize that my greatest victory was not any battle I had won, but the limiting beliefs I had destroyed for everyone who would come after me. The British had chosen this remote island in the South Atlantic precisely because they believed it would erase me from history. That distance and isolation would make Europe forget Napoleon Bonaparte and accept the restoration of old dynasties as permanent. They understood my military genius and political ambition, but they failed to grasp something more powerful: that ideas, once released into the world, become impossible to contain or destroy. During those long days on St. Helena, dictating my memoirs to loyal companions who had followed me into final exile, I began to see my life differently. The defeats that had seemed so catastrophic at the time, Russia, Leipzig, Waterloo revealed themselves as necessary steps in a larger transformation that had changed not just France, but the fundamental assumptions that governed European civilization. I had spent my career believing that my greatest achievement was building an empire, conquering territories, commanding armies, wearing crowns. But from the perspective of exile, I could see that these tangible accomplishments were less important than the intangible transformations they had made possible. The Napoleonic Code was still being adopted by nations across the world, proving that legal equality could replace hereditary privilege as the basis for civil society. The careers open tutelant principle I had established continued inspiring young people from modest backgrounds to pursue achievements their parents never could have imagined. The examples of my marshal's men who had risen from sergeant to duke through merit alone remained proof that social mobility was possible when systems were designed to reward capability rather than inheritance. Most importantly, I had demonstrated that individual will, properly applied, could reshape the circumstances that others accepted as permanent. Every person who had been told they were destined for mediocrity, every dreamer who had been informed that their ambitions exceeded their station, every innovator who had been warned that their ideas violated established wisdom, they all had my example as proof that limiting beliefs could be overcome through sufficient determination and intelligence. The young men across Europe who were challenging old hierarchies, demanding political reform, fighting for national independence, they were applying principles I had embodied rather than merely preached. The limiting belief that ordinary people can't change history had been permanently shattered by a Corsican artillery officer who had reorganized the continent according to his own vision. But perhaps my greatest legacy was more subtle. I had proven that failure is not final unless you accept it as such. My own story from exile in Elba, to triumph in the 100 days to defeat at Waterloo, to final exile on St. Helena, demonstrated that circumstances change, that opportunities continue arising, that the game is never over until you stop playing. Even on St. Helena, even in final defeat, even facing inevitable death, I was still destroying limiting beliefs. The British had expected exile to break my spirit, to transform the emperor into a broken old man grateful for their mercy. Instead, they found themselves guarding someone who used isolation as an opportunity for intellectual development, who treated defeat as education rather than destruction. My dictated memoirs became weapons in this final campaign. Every page that recorded my victories reminded readers that extraordinary achievement was possible for those willing to pay its price. Every chapter that analyzed my defeats taught lessons about how temporary setbacks could be transformed into permanent wisdom. Every story I told about rising from modest origins to imperial power provided hope for anyone who felt trapped by their circumstances. I learned during those final years that the most powerful legacy is not what you accomplished, but what you made possible for others to accomplish. The Napoleon who conquered Europe would be forgotten, but the Napoleon who proved that conquest was possible would live forever in the aspirations of everyone who refused to accept limitation as destiny. The death mask that would be made of my face became my final symbol, proof that even death cannot destroy what you truly build. Physical existence is temporary, but influence can be eternal. Empires collapse, but ideas endure. Bodies fail, but examples inspire across centuries. My final message to you is this: your greatest victory is not what you achieve for yourself, but what you make possible for others to achieve. Every limiting belief you destroy in your own life creates space for someone else to grow into possibilities they never imagined. Every barrier you break through becomes a path that others can follow. Every example you set of refusing to accept impossible as final becomes permission for countless others to attempt their own impossibilities. The boy from Corsica who was told he would never amount to anything became the emperor who reshaped Europe, and the exile who continued teaching until his final breath. If that transformation is possible, if that rise can happen, if those limiting beliefs can be destroyed, then no limitation you face today is permanent, no circumstance you endure now is final, and no dream you harbor is too large for someone with sufficient courage to pursue it. The imperial crown may have been taken from my head, but the imperial possibility remains available to anyone willing to crown themselves with the conviction that they are capable of more than their circumstances. Suggest, that is the legacy I leave you, not the memory of Napoleon Bonaparte, but the permission to become whatever you have the courage to attempt.